Okay, HI 122, continuing in chapter 29 here, we're going to talk about the end of the Cold War and George Herbert Walker Bush, who takes over for Reagan in 1989, and his son will also become president, and that made them the second father and son presidential duo in history. The first was John Adams and John Quincy Adams. And Reagan would prove to be a tough act to follow. His two-term vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, won the Republican presidential nomination in 1988. Born into a prominent New England family, the son of a United States Senator, he enlisted at age 18 in the United States Navy at the start of World War II, becoming America's youngest combat pilot. After his distinguished service in the war, Bush graduated from Yale University, where he was a good baseball player, first baseman, and thereafter moved with his family to West Texas, where he became a wealthy oil executive, before entering government service, first as a member of the U.S. House of Representatives, then as a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations and a diplomat in China. That's in the 70s, and he was the head of the CIA before becoming vice president in 1981. In those roles, Bush had displayed intelligence, integrity, and courage. But he lacked Reagan's charm and speaking skills, and one Democrat described him as a man born with a silver foot in his mouth. Wow. And there is a huge democracy movement abroad. George Herbert Walker Bush entered the White House with more foreign policy experience than most presidents, and like Nixon before him, he preferred to deal with international relations rather than domestic issues such as the deficit, drug abuse, and the problems of the inner cities. And in the Soviet Union, amazing changes were underway. With the economy failing, Mikhail Gorbachev responded with policies of perestroika, economic restructuring, and glasnost, openness, a loosening of the centralized economic planning and censorship of the press. His foreign policy sought harmony with the West and trade. And perestroika is Gorbachev's series of political and economic reforms that included shifting a centrally planned communist economy to a mixed economy that allowed for capitalism. And glasnost led to the end of the totalitarian state, and it's also going to lead to the end of the empire under Gorbachev. Early in 1989, Soviet troops left Afghanistan after 9 years, and then Gorbachev renounced the right of the Soviet Union to intervene in the internal affairs of other communist countries. He renounces the Brezhnev Doctrine, and when that happens, Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia are going to break away from the control of the Soviet Union. And that's going to lead to the end of the Soviet Empire and the reunification of East and West Germany. And the end of the Berlin Wall is the most spectacular event in the collapse of the Soviet Empire. And it comes on November 9th, 1989, when Germans, using hand tools and even their bare hands, tore down the Berlin Wall, the chief symbol of the Cold War. And with the borders to the west now fully open, the communist government of East Germany collapsed and a freely elected government came to power. And October the 3rd, 1990, the 5 states of East Germany were reunited with West Germany. And this is an awesome picture. The troops just standing there as these guys are dismantling that Cold War iconic symbol. And a couple of days after, all the openings between East and West were open once again. The reform impulse that Gorbachev helped unleash in Eastern Bloc countries spread out of control within the Soviet Union itself, however, and a communist coup failed. Once the genie of freedom was released from the communist lamp, it took on a momentum of its own. And on August 18, 1991, a group of political and military leaders tried to seize the reins of power. They accosted Gorbachev at his vacation retreat in the Crimea and demanded that he proclaim a state of emergency and transfer his powers to them. And he replied, "Go to hell," whereupon he was placed under house arrest. And the coup was doomed from the start, however. It was poorly planned and clumsily implemented. It lacked effective coordination. The plotters failed to arrest popular leaders, such as Boris Yeltsin, the president of the Russian Republic. They also neglected to close the airports or cut off telephone and television communications, and they were opposed by key elements of the military and the KGB. And on August 20th, President Bush responded favorably to Yeltsin's request for support, and Bush persuaded other world leaders to join him in refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the new Soviet government. And the next day, word began to seep out that the plotters had given up and were fleeing. Several committed suicide, and a newly released Gorbachev ordered the others arrested. Yet things did not go back the way they had been. Although Gorbachev reclaimed the title of president, he was forced to resign as head of the Communist Party and admit that he had made a grave mistake in appointing the men who had turned against him. And Boris Yeltsin emerged as the most popular political figure in the country, and the Commonwealth of Independent States will soon be established with Yeltsin as its president. So what had begun as a reactionary coup turned into a powerful accelerant for astonishing changes in the Soviet Union, or the Soviet disunion, as one journalist termed it. Most of the 15 republics proclaimed their independence, and the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, regained the status of independent nations. The Communist Party was dismantled, prompting celebrating crowds to topple statues of Lenin and other communist heroes. Now, this reduces the nuclear threat, and it's the end of the Soviet threat. So, in late 1991, President Bush announced that the United States would destroy all its tactical nuclear weapons in Europe and Asia. Bush explained that the prospect of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe was no longer a realistic threat, and that this transformation provided an unprecedented opportunity for reducing the threat of nuclear holocaust. President Gorbachev responded by announcing similar Soviet cutbacks. The sudden end of the Cold War led many to believe that the United States could greatly reduce the vast global military responsibilities that it had developed over 4 decades of anti-communism. And we'll stop here in this video, and we'll pick up with Bush's post-Cold War foreign policy and some of the events that happened in the rest of his presidency.